Most people only see the maintained trails and marked viewpoints, but the work behind those spaces happens far from where visitors usually go. These stories come from isolated stations where routine checks and quiet nights sometimes give way to things that don't fit any report. The details are small at first, easy to overlook, until they aren't. I was in my second season working a backcountry ranger post in the northern section of the Frank Church Wilderness, the kind of assignment where your nearest coworker is a 2-hour drive down a service road that barely counts as one, and the rest of your contact comes through scheduled radio check-ins that crackle more than they carry voices. And most of my days followed the same pattern of clearing minor trail obstructions, checking fire rings at designated sites, and updating the permit board bolted to a weathered plywood wall outside the cabin, which had a warped edge that never quite shut flush no matter how many times I adjusted it. The first thing that stood out that week wasn't dramatic, but just a line in the sign-in log that didn't make sense because someone had written an entry for a trailhead that had been closed since late spring due to washed-out bridge. And I remember standing there with my pen hovering over the page, rereading the name like I'd missed something obvious. But the date was current and the handwriting steady, not rushed or messy, which you usually see from hikers filling those out quickly before heading in. And I made a note to check the trail junction the next morning, assuming someone had either ignored the closure sign or come in from an unmarked access point further downriver. That evening the wind shifted hard out of the west, and pushed through the trees in a way that made the cabin creak along the roof seams, and I had the small propane lantern going on the desk while I logged routine maintenance notes, the radio idling low with that constant static hum. When I caught the sound of gravel moving outside, not footsteps exactly, more like the slow roll of a boot turning in place, and I stepped out with a flashlight, expecting to see a late hiker looking for directions. But the clearing was empty except for my own truck, and the tool shed, sitting about 20 yards off to the side with its door shut tight, and I swept the beam across the tree line longer than I needed to before going back in, telling myself it was probably a deer shifting around near the edge of the clearing, though I didn't hear any follow-up movement that you usually get with animals. The next morning I took the ATV down toward the closed trail section, following a narrow cut that dipped along the riverbank, and about half a mile in I found fresh tire impressions pressed into a patch of soft ground, where no vehicles were supposed to be, the tread deeper than a standard pickup, and spaced wider. Like something heavier had come through recently, and they didn't match anything used by the Forest Service in that district, which I knew because we only had 2 vehicles assigned, and both were accounted for back at the station. And I followed those tracks for as long as they held before they broke apart over rock. But what stayed consistent was that they were heading deeper into the restricted section, not out of it. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sky had gone overcast, and the air felt heavier, the kind of pressure that usually means weather moving in faster than forecast. So I ran through the standard checks, secured the fuel drum behind the shed, tightened the latch on the generator housing, and tried to raise the main station over radio to report the unauthorized vehicle tracks. But all I got was intermittent bursts of static, and a clipped half response that cut out before I could make out words, which wasn't unusual in that terrain, but it meant I was effectively on my own until the next clear window. It was later, closer to dusk, when I noticed the permit board again because one of the papers had shifted, just slightly out of alignment. And when I stepped closer, I saw that the same name from the logbook had been added a second time underneath the first entry. Same handwriting, same steady pressure, but this time the listed route was different. A loop that passed within a mile of my station before cutting east toward an unmaintained spur. And I knew I hadn't seen that entry earlier because I had checked the board twice that morning before heading out, and the screws holding the plastic cover in place were still tight, meaning whoever added it had taken the time to open it properly, rather than just slipping something underneath. I didn't like that, not because it was overtly threatening, but because it meant someone had been close enough to the cabin during the day to stand there and write without me noticing, and the clearing around the station doesn't offer much cover unless you stay right at the edge of the trees. Which meant they had likely been watching long enough to know when I was away. I kept the exterior light off that night, which isn't standard, but it made more sense than lighting myself up against the dot. And I sat inside with the radio turned up just enough to catch any signal, listening to the generator tick as it cooled down after I shut it off to conserve fuel. And sometime after midnight, I heard the same gravel shift again, closer this time, followed by a soft metallic tap that I recognized immediately as the latch on the tool shed being tested. Not forced, just lifted slightly and let fall back into place, like someone checking if it was secured. I didn't go out, which is something I went back and forth on later, but the protocol in that kind of isolation leans towards staying inside unless there's a clear emergency, and I kept the flashlight off, letting my eyes adjust to the dark interior while I watched the outline of the doorway. And after a minute or two, the sound stopped, replaced by nothing at all. No retreating footsteps, no brush movement, just the kind of silence that feels deliberate. At first light, I went straight to the shed and found the latch exactly as I'd left it, but the dust along the lower panel had been disturbed, not wiped clean, just scuffed in a way that suggested someone had stood there shifting their weight for a while. And on the ground nearby there were faint impressions that didn't match standard hiking boots. The sole pattern more uniform, almost industrial, like something you'd see on worksite footwear rather than trail gear. I reported everything once the radio cleared enough to carry my voice, and by late afternoon, a district ranger told me they'd send someone out the following day to take a look, which sounded routine over the radio, calm and procedural. But that same evening, while I was flipping back through the logbook to double-check the entries, I noticed something I hadn't caught before because of how subtle it was. The ink on the second entry wasn't just the same handwriting, it was the same pen, down to a tiny skip in the stroke on the letter R. And that wouldn't have meant much on its own, except that the pen, clipped to the side of the logbook, the one I'd been using all week, was missing. And I was certain I hadn't taken it outside at any point. I wasn't a career ranger, just a contracted seasonal hire in my early 40s, filling in at a desert contact station along the eastern edge of Big Bend, where the paved road ends and everything beyond turns to hardpack and dust. And most of my job revolved around issuing backcountry permits, checking water caches, and logging vehicle plates from people heading into the more remote sectors, where GPS drops out and cell service disappears entirely. And the work itself was quiet enough that you started to notice patterns without trying. Who came through at what time, which routes people favored depending on the weather, even how long they usually took to return. And that's why the truck stood out right away, because it showed up just before sunset and parked at an angle that blocked part of a narrow turnaround. Not fully careless, but not how someone familiar with the place would leave it either. And I remember stepping out from the shade of the station awning with the clipboard in my hand, expecting a tired couple or a solo hiker needing directions. But the driver stayed inside longer than normal, engine still running, headlights washing over the signboard, until I raised a hand to shield my eyes. And when he finally stepped out, he didn't approach the desk right away. Just stood there looking past me toward the small equipment shed behind the station, like he was taking inventory of things that shouldn't matter to a visitor. When he did come up, he asked for a permit into a sector that had been temporarily restricted due to unstable terrain after a late-season storm. And I explained the closure the same way I had to a dozen others that week, pointing to the marked section on the map where the washout had cut through the access route. But he didn't look at the map, just kept his eyes on the edge of the counter where the radio handset rested. And after a pause, he said, "I heard it was open again," in a tone that didn't sound like a question, more like he was checking if I'd contradict him. And I told him no, it wasn't, not yet. And that was when he gave a short nod and said he'd find somewhere else, then walked back to his truck without asking about any alternatives. Which was unusual because most people pressed for suggestions, or at least asked about nearby sites. I logged the plate number out of habit as he pulled away, watching the dust trail settle slowly behind him as the sun dropped lower. And I figured that was the end of it, until about an hour later, when I was closing up the permit board and noticed a second set of tire tracks cutting across the lot, fresher than the earlier ones, leading in from a direction that didn't connect to any marked road, and they stopped briefly near the equipment shed before looping back out the same way, and I hadn't heard an engine. During that time, which stuck with me, because out there sound carries clean across open ground, unless the wind is strong, and that evening was still, almost too still, the air holding onto the day's heat even after dark. I tried raising the main office on the radio to report the odd vehicle movement, but the signal kept dropping into static bursts, so I made a written note instead and secured the station, locking the supply cabinet and double-checking the water tank valve. Then settled in at the small desk inside, with the door propped open just enough to catch any sound outside, a habit I'd picked up after a few long nights out there. Then sometime after midnight, I heard a low mechanical noise, not close, but steady, like an engine idling at a distance, where it blended with the natural hum of the desert, and I stepped outside to get a better sense of direction. Scanning the horizon, where faint light sometimes reflects off distant vehicles, but instead of seeing movement, I caught a brief flicker near the far edge of the lot, close to where those unmarked tire tracks had appeared earlier. And it wasn't headlights, more like someone shielding a flashlight beam intermittently, letting it slip out in short bursts before covering it again. I didn't call out, just stood there listening. And after a few seconds the light stopped completely, the engine noise fading shortly after, as if whoever it was had killed it, or moved away slowly enough to avoid drawing attention, and I went back inside, closed the door fully this time, and locked it, which wasn't standard unless there was a clear reason, but something about the way that light had been controlled, not sweeping or searching but measured, made it feel less like a lost visitor, and more like someone trying not to be seen. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the lot and followed the second set of tracks as far as I could before they broke over harder ground. And near the spot where they had paused by the shed, I found a small indentation in the dust, where something rectangular had been set down briefly. Not heavy enough to leave a deep mark, but distinct enough to notice if you were looking for it. And next to it, partially pressed into the surface, was a torn corner of paper that matched the color of the permit forms we kept inside, except the edge was cleanly cut rather than torn by hand. I checked the stack back at the station and found one missing, not from the top but from somewhere in the middle, which meant someone had gone through the pile deliberately. And when I flipped through the remaining forms, I saw that one had been filled out in advance with a name that didn't match the driver's license the man had shown me the night before. And the listed route was the same restricted sector he'd asked about, only this time the entry indicated an unguarded overnight stay beginning that same evening. I reported everything once I got a clear radio window, including the mismatched permit and the vehicle tracks, and the response I got back was cautious but non-committal, telling me to suspend permit issuance for that sector entirely until further notice, and to remain at the station until someone could come out. But what stayed with me wasn't the paperwork or the tracks. It was something I noticed just before the relief ranger arrived the next day. When I went to log the incident formally and saw that the plate number I'd written down the previous evening had been crossed out and replaced with a different one, in handwriting that wasn't mine, even though I hadn't left the station long enough for anyone else to come through unnoticed, and the original number was still faintly visible underneath, just enough to read if you looked closely. I took the winter rotation at a fire lookout support cabin in the Bitterroot Range, mostly because no one else wanted it. And at 32, I figured a few months of snowpack monitoring and equipment checks would be a quiet break from the busier summer assignments. But winter work up there has a different kind of pressure to it. Not from people, but from isolation and timing. Because once the access road ice is over, you're committed to whatever happens until the next scheduled supply run or weather window. And the cabin itself sat below the actual lookout tower, connected by a narrow switchbacking path that drifted over easily after each snowfall. So part of my daily routine was packing that trail down, checking the wind instruments at the top, and logging temperature and visibility readings that got relayed back through a repeater station that only held signal for short intervals when the air was clear. The first irregularity came during one of those routine mornings when the sky was flat and gray. No defined cloud layers, just a uniform cover that made depth hard to judge. And I was halfway up to the tower when I noticed a second line of impressions beside my own, from the previous day's path. Not fresh exactly, but preserved well enough in the cold that the edges were still crisp. And they weren't from snowshoes or standard winter boots. The spacing too narrow, and the tread too shallow, like someone had walked it in lighter footwear without sinking as much as they should have, which didn't make sense given the depth of the snowpack. And I stood there longer than I needed to, looking at how those tracks overlapped mine in places and veered off slightly in others, then continued all the way up to the tower without doubling back. I checked the instruments, logged the readings, and tried to convince myself they could have been older than they looked, maybe from before the last storm. Though I knew that storm had wiped everything clean, and when I came back down, I followed the offshoot where the prints diverged, which led a short distance into a cluster of trees where the snow was less compacted by wind. And there, partially buried, I found a length of thin cord, tied loosely around a branch at about shoulder height. Not bright or obvious, just a dull gray that blended into the bark, and it wasn't attached to anything else, just looped once and left hanging, which didn't serve any clear purpose I could think of. I removed it, more out of habit than concern, and pocketed it before heading back to the cabin, where the generator had kicked off during my absence, leaving the interior colder than expected. So I spent the next hour restarting it and checking the fuel line for ice buildup. A normal enough issue in those temperatures, and by the time I got everything running again, the light outside had shifted toward late afternoon, that dim blue tone you get before early winter darkness settles in. I attempted my scheduled radio check and got partial confirmation from the lower station, enough to log that I was operational, but the connection dropped before I could mention the tracks or the cord, and I told myself I'd include it in the next transmission window. That night the wind picked up hard along the ridge, pushing fine snow against the cabin walls in steady waves, and I stayed inside, reviewing the previous week's logs and marking small discrepancies in the temperature readings that I planned to recalibrate in the morning. And sometime after midnight I heard a dull impact from outside, not sharp like something striking the wall, but more like weight settling against it, followed by a faint dragging sound along the exterior siding that moved slowly from one end of the cabin toward the other, stopping briefly near the door before continuing on, and I remember holding still, listening for any follow-up. But the wind masked most of the detail, turning everything into a low, constant rush. I didn't open the door, partly because of the conditions, and partly because stepping out into that kind of darkness without a clear reason isn't something you do lightly up there. And eventually the sound faded, or blended into the storm enough that I couldn't separate it anymore. In the morning, the sky had cleared just enough to reveal a sharp contrast between the drifted snow and the exposed ridgeline, and I stepped outside to check for any visible damage, expecting to see a fallen branch or something that had been pushed against the cabin overnight. But instead I found a shallow trough running along the base of the wall where the snow had been compressed in a long, uneven line, and beside it, spaced at irregular intervals, were those same marrow impressions I'd seen on the path, circling the cabin once before, leading back toward the tree line. And what stood out this time was how close they came to the windows, at one point angling in so near that the edge of the track brushed the wooden frame. I followed them as far as I could again, but they disappeared into an area where the wind had scored the ground clean, leaving only patches of exposed ice and rock, and I lost them completely within a few yards. Back inside, I made a detailed note of everything and waited for the next radio window, which came mid-morning. And when I finally got through, I reported the tracks, the cord, and the overnight disturbance, expecting some kind of directive to stay put, or at least heightened awareness. But the response I got was delayed and slightly distorted, the voice on the other end repeating my own call sign back to me, twice before giving a short acknowledgement and saying they'd check recent access logs for the area, which didn't make much sense because no one was scheduled to be up there during that period. The rest of the day passed without further incident, though I kept catching myself glancing toward the path leading up to the tower, half expecting to see new movement. And as the light started to fade again, I decided to make one more trip up to secure the instruments before nightfall. Following the pack trail carefully, and when I reached the top I noticed something I hadn't seen earlier. Not because it was hidden, but because it hadn't been there before. A small metal clip attached to the railing on the windward side of the tower, the kind used to secure lightweight lines. And tied to it was a short length of that same gray cord I'd found in the trees. Only this piece had been cut clean at both ends, and it hung there just long enough to move slightly in the wind, tapping softly against the metal post. And when I turned to look back down toward the cabin, I realized the path between the two had been walked again since my last pass. A fresh set of those same narrow impressions laid directly over my own tracks, leading both up to where I stood and back down toward the cabin door, even though I had been inside the entire time since morning, and the only radio. Ew! Okay, the concept was captive. Unlikely.
Confirmation I'd received that day had come from a voice that took just a little too long to recognize my call sign.
I was 56 that year, close enough to retirement that they started offering me the slower assignments, which is how I ended up running a small trail management outpost along the western edge of Olympic National Forest, a damp, low-elevation sector where the work was less about search and rescue and more about maintaining footbridges, clearing blowdown, and keeping an eye on a network of unofficial trails that locals had carved out over the years and never quite admitted to using. And the station itself was a single-room structure with a covered porch, a locked storage cage bolted to the back wall, and a radio setup that only worked reliably when the weather held steady, which it rarely did in that part of Washington. The first sign that something wasn't lining up came during a routine inspection of the permit board near the main trail junction, about a mile down from the outpost, where I noticed a cluster of backcountry slips pinned in a way that didn't match how we posted them, grouped too tightly, almost layered, like someone had been trying to obscure the earlier entries beneath newer ones. And when I pulled them apart, I saw that 3 separate permits listed the same entry time, within a 10-minute window, but different party sizes, all signed with variations of the same last name, spelled slightly differently each time, which could have been sloppy handwriting, except the rest of each form was filled out carefully, block letters, consistent pressure. I took photos of the permits with the department-issued camera and brought them back to the station to log later, figuring it was either a group trying to bypass limits or someone filling out extras to mislead the counts, which had happened before in less remote areas, though not usually this far out. The weather turned that afternoon. A steady rain moving in off the coast, soft at first but persistent, and by early evening the forest had that muted, enclosed feel, where sound doesn't travel far, and everything beyond a few yards fades into a kind of gray-green blur. And I was inside updating maintenance records when I heard a vehicle approach, slow and cautious, tires moving over wet gravel rather than the main access road, which told me they were coming in from one of the side spurs that weren't officially open, and I stepped onto the porch expecting to flag them down, but the vehicle stopped short of the clearing, engine idling, partially obscured by a stand of alder trees, and after a few seconds the engine cut off without the driver stepping out. I called out once, just a standard green, but there was no response. And after waiting longer than felt necessary, I walked halfway down the path toward where I'd last seen the outline of the vehicle, though the rain and the fading light made it difficult to see clearly, and by the time I reached the edge of the clearing, there was nothing there. No headlights, no silhouette, just the empty track where something had recently been, the wet ground holding the shape of the tires for a moment before the rain began to soften the edges. I went back to the station and made a note of it, including the direction of approach, then checked the storage cage out back, more out of routine than suspicion, and found that one of the padlocks had been reattached incorrectly. The shackle seated but not fully latched, something that wouldn't happen if it had been left alone. And inside, nothing appeared to be missing at a glance, though one of the coils of trail marker ribbon had been unspooled slightly, just enough that a length of it hung loose over the edge of the shelf. I secured everything properly and went back inside, closing the door against the rain, and tried to raise the district office on the radio to report both the vehicle and the permits, but the signal kept breaking apart, the static cutting through my transmission in uneven bursts. So I logged it in writing and set it aside for the next clear window. Sometime later, As the light dropped further and the rain intensified, I noticed a faint line of color through the trees beyond the back of the station, something that didn't belong to the natural tones of the forest. And when I stepped closer to the window, I realized it was that same bright survey ribbon, stretched low between two trunks about 20 yards out, angled in a way that pointed directly toward the rear of the building. And I knew I hadn't placed it there because we only use that color for marking temporary closures along trails, not around the station itself. I grabbed a flashlight and went out to take a closer look, following the line of ribbon as it extended further into the trees, branching once, then again, each segment tied at roughly waist height, forming a loose path that curved around behind the station and continued toward the direction where I'd heard the vehicle earlier. And the placement was deliberate, not random, spaced evenly, as if someone had planned the route in advance. I cut the ribbon down as I went, coiling it into my hand, and the further I followed it, the more it felt like I was being guided somewhere specific. Though I couldn't see what that end point was, until the trees thinned slightly, and I came across a small clearing I hadn't noticed before, just off the unofficial trail network, where the ground was churned up enough to suggest repeated foot traffic, despite the rain. And in the center of that clearing was a shallow depression covered loosely with branches and leaves. Not deep, not concealed well enough to be a proper pit, but intentional enough to stand out once you were looking at it. I didn't disturb it, just stood there for a moment, listening to the rain hitting the canopy above and the distant rush of water from a nearby creek, and then I turned back toward the station, following my own path where I'd cut the ribbon down. Only when I got back, I noticed something I hadn't seen when I left. The porch light, which I was certain I'd turned off before going out, was on now, casting a dim yellow glow across the wet ground. And through the front window I could see the outline of the desk inside, the logbook open to a page that I hadn't been working on earlier. And when I stepped inside to check it, the 3 permit names I'd photographed that afternoon had been written again across the top of a fresh page, in the same careful block lettering, except this time the dates listed were for the following day, and next to each name, in a smaller script that didn't match the rest, someone had added a simple note that read, "Confirmed." I was 27 and still pretty new to federal work when they assigned me to a remote canyon contact station in southern Utah, the kind of place that only saw a handful of vehicles a day once you got past the main scenic loop. And my job was mostly to check overnight permits for people heading into the slot canyons, monitor weather alerts for flash flood risk, and keep the small solar system running that power the radio and the exterior beacon light, which blinked steadily after dark so late arrivals could find the station without driving off the edge of the access road. That week had been unusually hot, even for late summer, the kind of dry heat that made the metal fixtures too hot to touch by midday, and we'd already issued a temporary advisory for unstable canyon walls after a minor rockfall was reported further west. So I was paying closer attention than usual to who was coming and going, especially anyone trying to enter restricted areas. And the first thing that stuck out was a call that came over the radio just after noon. Faint but clear enough to make out a voice, asking for route confirmation into a canyon sector that didn't have any active permits that day. And when I responded asking them to identify their location, there was a pause long enough that I thought the signal had dropped, before the same voice came back and gave a trail name that was about 15 miles north of mine. Station, in an area where the repeater coverage didn't usually reach. I logged the call and tried to raise them again, but got nothing in return, which I chucked up to signal bounce, something that happened occasionally in that terrain, though the clarity of the first transmission didn't quite fit with that explanation. Later that afternoon, a single vehicle came in, a light-colored SUV, without estate plates, and the driver approached with a folded map already in hand, asking about access to that same canyon sector mentioned in the radio call. Only this time he referred to it by an older, unofficial name that wasn't printed on any current maps. And when I told him the area was restricted, he didn't argue, just nodded and asked if there were any alternate routes nearby that would connect through eventually, which wasn't how those canyon systems worked, and I explained that clearly, pointing out the dead ends and the risk factors. but he seemed more interested in the layout than the warning, studying the spacing between trailheads rather than the marked closures. I issued him a permit for a different, open route, and watched him leave, noting the time and direction as part of routine logging. And then I went out back to check the solar battery housing because the indicator had been fluctuating slightly, something I'd noticed over the past 2 days but hadn't fully investigated yet. And when I opened the air panel, I found the wiring intact, but the terminal screws loosened just enough to cause intermittent contact. Not disconnected, just backed off a turn or two, which doesn't happen on its own, especially not in dry conditions with no recent maintenance work done. I tightened everything down and closed the housing, making a note to report it, along with the radio anomaly. And as the sun started to drop behind the canyon walls, the temperature shifted quickly, the heat bleeding off into the open air, leaving that sudden chill that always catches people off guard out there. And I turned on the exterior beacon as usual, watching it blink against the darkening sky while I finished up the day's logs inside. Sometime after full dark, I heard a vehicle approach, slower than before, the sound of tires crunching over gravel in short bursts like the driver was stopping and starting. And when I stepped outside, the beacon light caught the outline of the same SUV from earlier. Only now, it was positioned further back from the station, not pulling all the way in, and the headlights were off, which made it harder to see inside. But I could make out the driver's silhouette, leaning forward over the wheel, not moving. I called out, asking if everything was all right, and after a moment he opened the door and stepped out, holding the permit I'd issued him, and said he thought he might have taken a wrong turn. His voice steady but quieter than before, almost like he didn't want it to carry beyond the immediate area. And when I asked where he'd gone, he gave a route that didn't match the permit or any logical path from the station, describing a turnoff that didn't exist on the map. And I started to correct him, but he cut me off with a quick shake of his head and said, "No, I saw it," then looked past me, toward the beacon light, as it blinked again, and added, "Right where that lines up," which didn't make sense because the beacon wasn't aligned with any road or trail, just the station itself. I told him he needed to head back up to the main junction and follow the marked route I'd given him. And he nodded again, got back into the vehicle, and drove off in the correct direction this time, the red of his taillights fading as he rounded the bend, and I stood there for a minute longer than necessary, watching the empty road before going back inside. It wasn't until later, when I went to shut down for the night and did a final check of the equipment, that I noticed the beacon light had stopped blinking, stuck in a constant dim glow instead of its usual steady pulse. And when I opened the control box to inspect it, I found the timing module still in place, but the wiring altered slightly. Not damaged, just rerouted in a way that changed the signal pattern, something that would require a basic understanding of the system to do. And as I was standing there looking at it, trying to figure out when that could have happened, the radio came to life again, with that same voice from earlier in the day, clear and close this time, asking for confirmation of the correct alignment point. And before I could respond, the transmission cut off, leaving only the soft, empty hiss of the channel. And when I went back to the logbook to document it, I saw that the permit I'd issued that afternoon was no longer in the outgoing stack where I'd placed it, but instead had been filed neatly back into the blank forms section, as if it had never been used at all.